And we're on. Thomas, good morning or good afternoon. As the case
good evening, yeah.
Yeah, or good evening. So this is the Applied Ethics Center podcast. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Thomas Brudholm. Thomas is an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen and the Department of Cross-Cultural and Regional Studies. And Thomas has written some very important works on resentment, has a big book on hatred coming out this spring with Oxford, has an important collection on the Emotions and Mass Atrocity coming out soon. So Thomas, welcome. It's great to see you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And so Thomas, since you've done this incredible work through the years on resentment and hatred, I thought, what an interesting and uplifting topic for our listeners to get some more insight into. So I wanted to maybe start with asking, you're coming out with this new book about hate and giving a philosophical account of hate. How did you become interested in that?
Well, there's a short story and a little longer story.
Okay.
and the short story is that around 7 years ago, the whole discourse or concept of hate crime came to Denmark and came to Europe more widely. So we suddenly got this word, hadforbrydelser, hate crime in Danish. And I wondered, what's that? We have never heard about that before. Maybe someone could remember reading something about something happening in the US, and then you would see the word in English, hate crime. But suddenly people, human rights advocates, and others started talking about hate crime. And at the same time, I had kind of maybe floating in the back of my mind, something to do with hatred, because I had, as you also mentioned, worked on anger and resentment previously. In my work on resentment or anger, hatred figured kind of always in the background as the evil other, as what anger and resentment was definitely not, and what it should not be conflated with. So I kind of mistreated hatred the way that I liked resentment not to be treated. So I owed hatred more hatred. And finally, at the same time, before I came to the University of Copenhagen, I worked at a department for genocide and Holocaust studies. And in the field of genocide studies, hatred has been discussed for long, and there are heated debates for long about the causal role of hate in genocide, but often with little or no reflection on what do we mean when we talk about hate. There was a kind of confluence of different reasons for settling on this happy topic of hatred. Yeah.
So to pick up a couple of the threads there, when you say that you mistreated the idea of hatred, or that this idea of hatred deserves an apology, why is it that it deserves being treated more seriously? Why is it that it deserves this more nuanced examination? Are there some versions of hatred that we should think about as more legitimate than others? So I guess my question is, why wasn't your initial response to say, resentment and anger, maybe there's something to save from them and they're important politically, but hate is just destructive, which kind of would be I assume, the layperson's response? Why not just go with that?
Yeah, that was my response.
Yeah, right.
To begin with. And when I started working on hate too, it was mainly for kind of analytical reasons, simply to become more clear about what do we mean, not as in the case of anger and resentment to kind of defend anger. In the case of resentment and anger, I myself was a bit angry on behalf of genocide survivors and apartheid and torture victims who, as I saw it, was sometimes kind of pushed to try forgive when they perhaps shouldn't. And in that context, I as many others, I not just explained but also defended anger. Okay. And when I began working on hate, to begin with, it was not to try defend it, and it's probably not even that now. But I do think that we need to stop and think about the possibility that hatred is not always or necessarily the kind of pathological, bad and vicious emotion that we often take it to be. Mm-hmm. And I think we often, or not often, but we sometimes even they use it in a very different sense, mm-hmm. So where it is something positive.
Can you give me some examples where hate would be?
For example, in Karl Popper, the theorist of science, he has an essay. It's hidden at the end of a very thick book, mm-hmm. But he explains that something very important to him and to his work is that he hates violence. And he says himself, it's irrational, I cannot explain it, but it's very important. So there often hate is used in a positive sense when directed against, of course, vices and evils as violence itself. But perhaps more interestingly, today, especially in the UK, in campaigns against hate crime and hate speech, you find again and again the use of hate as something unequivocally evil and bad. Mm-hmm. So we hate disablism, we hate anti-Semitism, we hate this and that. But then sometimes there is this appeal to hatred as something we should feel and direct toward these evils. And there are several campaigns also by police stations where there's an appeal to hate. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting from a philosophical point of view. What's the difference between the hatreds that we hate and the hate with which we are supposed to hate them?
That's really good. So there's this double negative kind of version of hatred that, I mean, tell me if this is fair, that there are phenomena that are so hateful that the only appropriate approach to them is hating them.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Are there other cases? I mean, I know that both in your work and in some other work about resentment and anger, sometimes resentment and anger are taken to be, rather than something that traps us in the past, an indication of appropriate self-respect, or that the inability to be angry and resentful somehow worries us because it means you don't take the harms done to you seriously enough. Is there a context in which hate is like that too? For example, I'm trying to think, if somebody commits a terrible personal crime against you, something like hurting your child or rape or so on and so forth, is there a problem with not hating them under those circumstances for a similar argument?
That could be, but it's definitely much more controversial because typically we tend to construe anger and resentment as an emotion or attitude that is compatible with still seeing the other and treating the other as a fellow human being, and as someone that surely should be held to account. But that's it. Whereas in hatred, there's often the perception or the idea that it comes together with a dehumanizing attitude and with an attitude to the other as someone who is rotten to the bone and the object of appropriate desires for elimination.
I got it.
And that is, of course, if you even go into a direction where you defend that when directed toward other persons, it's quite controversial. And there's a need for other philosophical distinctions, for example, between the very feeling of the desire to destroy or eliminate or expulse someone or some group on the one hand, and then acting on it. It might, in some cases, be not impermissible, or it might sometimes be permissible to feel the emotion, but not to act on it. For example, Primo Levi, the survivor of the Holocaust, famous for his very reasonable and humanistic reflections on being in Auschwitz. He also wrote a poem for Adolf Eichmann. And in that poem, he wishes Adolf Eichmann millions of sleepless nights. He kind of wishes endless suffering upon this man. And that wish in itself, given the circumstances of the crime and the responsibility of the person, might be not just psychologically understandable, but not wrong, at least, to feel, even if it would be wrong to try act on it.
Yeah. That kind of that's really interesting. That kind of brings me and connects me to something else you said when you described how you got interested in this, and has to do with the role of hate in mass atrocity or in genocide and the causal role. So what are you finding? I know that initially in your career you were influenced by some work that argued that it always has a causal role or doesn't have a causal role. Actually, I'm a little confused, but it doesn't have a causal role, right?
There are most scholars who like to be respected as such in the field of Holocaust and genocide studies tend to argue that hatred plays little or no role. Even, I mean, there are books with the title "Murder Without Hatred" about the Holocaust in the Baltic countries, and there's a long tradition from the Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman that stresses the insignificance of hatred as a planetarily interesting variable. On the other hand, there are other scholars who kind of argue that hatred is the prime causal factor behind, for example, the Holocaust. And eliminationism, in the word of Goldhagen, American historian, is key to understand genocides. I think I go with, I'm not a historian and I'm not a political theorist, so I'm not really myself into research as to the causal roles of genocide, but I definitely go with a multi-factor analysis where hate plays some role. But my ambition has not been to come up with a theory of the causes of genocide, but rather to prompt scholars who do that to think more broadly about hatred. And for example, the relationship between hatred and dehumanization in genocide.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about a lot of 20th century genocides has been that actually those have happened between groups that have had great empathy for each other in the sense of living together, intertwined, intermingled. One thinks about Rwanda, one thinks about the Balkans. These are people, and to some extent, even in parts of pre-World War II Europe, these are people who are deeply intermingled, do business with each other, intermarry, play together, go out together. And then almost always there's a relatively short campaign of dehumanization, because you do sort of traditionally ask yourself how these neighbors are able to kill each other and make this kind of turn. And it's taken easily that the missing link is some pretty effective campaign of dehumanization. So in your view, the hate is the result of the campaign of dehumanization, something else? Like how are those two related?
I think that's an enormously complex and really it's a very good question, and it's a very complex question, and part of the complexity also has to do with the ambiguity surrounding the concept of dehumanization. And sometimes if dehumanization means that you see the other as completely non-human, and this is a tempting view of dehumanization because we are all familiar with the animalistic metaphors or with the pathological metaphor. So the other is, or the victim group is depicted as rats, or as a plague, or as cockroaches and whatever. And if you take that on its take that for granted, if you think that dehumanization means the complete and utter rejection of the victim group from the category of human beings, then hatred might be an inappropriate emotion to think with, because and then we might rather speak about disgust or maybe contempt, but at least disgust, or an objective attitude. You simply have to deal with these animals or this plague, that evil. But then I think that is an insufficient concept of dehumanization. And I actually prefer maybe a bit a strange concept of monstrification. Because I think the good thing about thinking about dehumanization in terms of monstrification is that if you look more closely into the campaigns and the rhetoric of genocide, then you often see that the victim group is seen, depicted as something that is both human and non-human, inhuman. You need, on the one hand, the victim group to be able to be malevolent, to be able to wish for destruction. So you need something as a genocidaire that has the capabilities of human beings. On the other hand, you reduce the victim group to something pure evil. So what is interesting, I think, about dehumanization is exactly this kind of, you presuppose what you deny. The other is and is not a human being. See that in Hitler's Mein Kampf, for example, the Jew is both like a vampire, like disease, and evil, in a way that only a human being can be. And this is where hatred becomes relevant, because in kind of in hatred there can be this transfer of the other to the limit of what we can deal with as fellow human beings.
It's interesting. I wonder if, because that makes sense, that if all dehumanization means is making the victim group completely less than human, if that's successful, there's not much room in hating them. There's not much room left for hating them. They're sort of no longer even worthy of hate. And then, as you say, you either feel contempt or disgust, or just a practical attitude of, you need to clean them up and so on and so forth.
The monstrous other is a horrible other.
Capable
of great evil and destruction.
In a way, that's even right. In a way, that's even a version of superhumanizing rather than dehumanizing.
You could say that.
Right? They become some sort of super, like some kind of superhero or super villain. It's interesting because one of the first, like an early analysis of anti-Semitism claimed that some of the Europeans see the Jews as a ghost among the people, and kind of added a supernatural, superhuman type of approach that made them not only despicable but also an object of fear. And I think that goes nicely with the analysis that you're offering. I wonder empirically if there are some cases of genocide where one happens and some cases of genocide where the other happens. If I remember correctly, for example, seems to me like the Rwandan genocide was largely about dehumanization in the more primitive cockroaches sense. But I'm not sure if I'm completely right about that. So in other words, whether all of these cases involve monstrification or some involve more monstrification than others, and if the ones that involve more monstrification than others, somehow you could illustrate that more hate was involved.
Whoa. Now comes up your empirical political theorist.
No, I'm just curious.
I think that, of course, the the Holocaust and the Nazi depiction of the Jew is often taken as the kind of the paradigm example of the most monstrous kind of dehumanization.
Right.
And there's a long tradition of thinking about Nazi dehumanization in terms of something that is pure fantasy.
Yeah.
There's no kind of smoke where there's fire. It's also called, what is it? Langmuir talks about chimeric fantasies, purely monstrous. But I think that if you go, maybe we have to distinguish between the level of rhetorical campaigning, the pamphlets, the radio programs, where you might be able to find kind of pure, simple, complete, utter categorization of the victim group as purely not human. But I think as we move from rhetoric and propaganda to the killing fields, it's impossible. I think if you move to the micro descriptions of genocidal perpetration, whether you talk about neighbors or strangers, it's clear that you deal with another human being.
Yeah.
So there will be this maybe between the ideology of the other as a disease, as something that has to be destroyed, and the reality of the other as you see him right there, standing there as a woman or a child or a man.
So is your sense that, like, theoretically, that people like Hannah Arendt and Eichmann in Jerusalem, or Carl Schmitt and the concept of the political, they just don't take hatred seriously enough? This whole discussion of the enemy is not somebody you need to hate in Schmitt, it's just almost required for the definition of the in-group. And the more bureaucratic account, the famous bureaucratic account in Arendt, and that gives this rather than monstrous picture that came up from the Primo Levi poem of Eichmann, sort of dumb, unimpressive, boring, ambitious, and so on and so forth.
Yes, I think if I just stick to Hannah Arendt, I certainly think that there's a danger in just taking at face value what she writes and observes about Eichmann from her witness position in Jerusalem. And I think that it has to be supplemented, for example, with these poems and descriptions and reflections on behalf of the survivors and the victims.
Yeah.
But also the letters and the memories written by perpetrators themselves. And there you get, of course, much more massively complex picture.
Well, you know, it's funny because, or not funny, but I always, reading the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem, it always seemed like, given the way that she describes hate, or kind of the weight that she takes off of hate, the ending is a sort of deus ex machina a little bit. She said, well, here's this bureaucratic account, this, you know, really fascinating but somewhat emotionally vacant account that explains Eichmann. And in the end, we still have to kill you because you excluded yourself out of human company, or you've taken yourself out of human society, or some such. I don't remember the exact quote. And so that's a sort of unvengeful killing, if you want, that comes there. And at the very least, an account that gives more play to hate makes more sense of revenge also.
Yeah, it's a cold. Eichmann's hatred is described by the judges in Jerusalem as cold, thus much more vicious than the hatred we might know from literature. But Arendt and what she says to Adolf Eichmann at the end, that he and his fellow perpetrators of the Nazi genocide acted as if they were the masters of who were to live and not to live on the surface of the earth, and thus deserved to himself to be killed. That is, this justification of the elimination of Eichmann from the face of the earth might well be argued to be an instance of righteous hatred itself. Hatred always feels righteous for those who have it.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Thomas, reading through some of the materials you wrote on this, can you give me some highlights about where you see the most interesting moments about hatred from the history of philosophy? I mean, there would tend to be this first cut on this, which at least I ask, since hatred seems to be an irrational, in some ways, emotion, or an emotion that challenges rationality, or an emotion that overwhelms rationality, one would expect, at least in the kind of traditional Plato, Aristotle, Enlightenment, later on Enlightenment tradition, a suspiciousness of hate. Is that what you found?
I think, if speaking very roughly,
Mm-hmm.
I think we might say that Plato and Aristotle can be seen as the fathers of two rather different traditions of how to think about hatred in the West. Mm-hmm. And most of the philosophy of hatred, and also in the Enlightenment, are footnotes to Plato, so to say. Mm-hmm. And Plato, because Plato depicts as pathology in another, and Plato, in a very brief and often unnoticed passage in the Phaedo, introduces a concept of hatred of argumentation that he calls mysology. Mythos meaning hatred, and logos, of course, reasoning, argumentation. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a really interesting concept, and in that dialogue, I think Plato, as the first philosopher in the West, allows Socrates to explain kind of the anatomy of hatred, when hatred takes the form of a vice and a disease, that, according to Socrates, is the worst evil that can befall a man. Mysology, the hatred of argumentation, turns us away from, it not just does it turn us away, it encourages us to vilify and destroy reasoning and argumentation. And reasoning and argumentation and examining life is, of course, what makes life worth living. So hatred in itself, at least in the form of mysology, is the worst evil. So that's Plato. and then you can see from Plato and all the way up through philosophy.
It's a very specific form of hatred, right, though?
It's a specific form of hatred. And but you find again and again that philosophers are interested in the form of hate in different periods that is seen as a threat to what should matter the most to us. Mm-hmm. So in Immanuel Kant, much later, hatred is seen as a passion or Leidenschaft that destroys the autonomous exercise of reason. But this is then the one tradition. The other tradition, which is at least as interesting, is in Aristotle. And in Aristotle, misos, or hatred, is a normal and customary or acknowledged emotion, a response to perceived evil. So I think you can, in a way, you can see these two grand old philosophers as the fathers of two traditions. One that is absolutely against hatred, at least in the form that with which Plato is concerned, and another that allows for hatred in being exercised in vicious as well as virtuous versions.
So on an Aristotelian picture, the ability to feel hate at what's appropriately hateful can be an indication of virtue, actually?
Yeah.
Kind of like...
And the absence of the ability to hate things that are truly hateable or odious is a lack of virtue. I mean, if you are indifferent, or if you even appreciate things that are odious, it's a lack of virtue. But then hatred is, of course, something very different or partly different in Aristotle, because there are also similarities when you hate. You have this desire or motivation to expulse or eliminate the object of hate. Aristotle writes that the man who hates, or the person who hates, we might say, wishes that the who or what he hates should cease to exist. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of the classic idea of hate as this, the prototypically hatred move towards or motivates elimination, annihilation. Mm. This is what one of the most peculiar characteristics, I think, of hate, if you compare it to other emotions.
It's interesting. So there can definitely for Aristotle be a mean about hating, even.
Yeah, and you can even say that in his rhetoric, he provides the very first instruction in how to incite hatred. He treats, and that's so fascinating from our perspective today, that he treats hatred on a par with shame and anger and the other emotions. It's not taken out. I think today it appears sometimes like hatred is perhaps the last taboo emotion. I mean, you can be jealous, you can even have envy, you can be angry, but hate is kind of off limit, but not in Aristotle.
That's really interesting.
And then again, not in some of the campaigns today. This is what I found interesting, that going through hundreds and hundreds of campaigns against hate crime and seeing again and again the depiction of hate as an evil, as something that is incompatible with an enlightened mind, indeed as a form of prejudice or bigotry, then sometimes you have these campaigns where you have righteous citizens depicted in nice photographs, looking you straight in the eye, holding you to account, and then with a written message that I hate that I was indifferent, or I hate that I didn't call the police. So these people in this campaign from Thames Valley Police, they hate various kind of moral failures as they remember how they confronted hate crime. And in their remembrance, in their hateful remembrance of their passivity in the face of evil, they are committed to, another degree of citizen virtue. So in a very careful and delimited sense, you could say that this is a picture of hate as a citizen virtue.
I guess I'm curious if you open that's fascinating. And
it's a dangerous thing to open.
Is there, if you open that door, I mean, these are not only emotions that we're dealing with, but in some way our most powerful emotions. If you open that door to citizen virtue versions of hate, are you taking any risks? So in other words, if we...
I would much rather go with Arnold Schwarzenegger in his comment to what happened in what was it, Charlottesville? And Arnold Schwarzenegger in his fictive speech to President Trump says confidently that there are not two sides to bigotry. There are not two sides to hatred. Hatred is just to be condemned. And I think this is perhaps the message that sometimes needs to be what is the message in the public realm. But at the same time, as a philosopher, you cannot rest with that. I mean, it is a reduction of the phenomenon of hatred.
Right. I mean, it seems like in some ways there are two sides to hatred, that hating what is appropriate to hate is legitimate and important, and maybe not being able to do that is a sign of some sort of limitation.
But there are, of course, not two sides to prejudice.
Right.
I think there are not two sides to bigotry.
Right.
The point is that hatred is more than bigotry.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because in that context, for example, the so-called Antifa or anti-fascist movement here in the States rose to prominence, and that's been a violent movement. So, movement that essentially violently attacks fascism. and shows up in some of these neo-Nazi demonstrations and practices violence against them. There's been a lot of discussion here, including in my university, about whether that kind of violence by the left, from the left, anti-fascist violence is more legitimate than fascist violence. I don't think that they could be doing what they're doing without hating in some way. So it seems like hating is some kind of motivational condition. And it raises interesting question of, I mean, it kind of raises the question that you described as citizen virtue / the question from Popper. So that neighborhood of hatred, whether hatred that makes possible violence against the most hateful causes is somehow to be excused, to be celebrated, to be legitimized in some way. Go ahead. I mean, I guess the question that I have is, with hate, given how powerful it is, it's the one emotion that seems very close to action. Mm-hmm. Like that in some sense it has a greater proximity to action than anger, than resentment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I'm not sure whether it's correct. In a way, it's of course, there's a reason why hate crime is called hate crime. There is a sense that the hate drives the crime, and right. It's this. But at the same time, I wonder if you try compare anger and hate, whether you can even say that one or the other has a more kind of action, is more action motivating than the other. Because, for example, with regard to hate, one of the reasons why it's so complex to discuss is that we probably have to distinguish also between talking about hate as an occurrent emotion and as an attitude. So, for example, when Iago in Shakespeare's Othello, he says, "I hate the Moor or the Moor." I hate someone. It may mean that you, for decades, have hated someone, and you might continue hating this person for a lifetime. But that does not mean that you all the time walk around consciously feeling whatever it is to feel hate.
Right.
On the other hand, you can also say, "I hate the Moor," and in this very moment of uttering the words, you are possessed, you are filled with rage and destructive urge, and if you have hate, or if you feel hate as an occurrent emotion, then there might be a short step to anger. But hatred can then also be an attitude, and it can be cold, and it can be a passion that is compatible with calculation and reasoning, maybe to a much higher degree than anger and disgust, contempt. So you can have, I really hate this or that or those people, but I will not do anything for the moment. You find that also in Charles Darwin, in his classic on the expression of the emotions in human beings and animals, and he writes about hate, that it can be impossible to look at the person and see whether he hates or not.
That's really interesting. Makes me think about the new incarnations of white supremacists in this country, and that their hate has kind of driven them to repackage their message as an alternative right, try to make it in some neighborhoods more respectful, try to give it more of intellectual patina so that they can realize the agenda more. So that's actually really interesting, that the ability to view hate as an attitude actually allows for a greater degree of strategic planning.
It's dangerous to reduce hate to affect.
Yeah.
And I think also it's interesting because it runs through the entire tradition, this distinction or the eye to the possibility of hatred to take both forms. It's like love, being in love, being, all upset by it, and loving someone,
right,
loving for life. And Kant, Immanuel Kant, he expressed it wonderfully, poetically, I think, when he compared anger as an affect and hatred as a passion. And he writes that something like, if the affect of anger is like water in the river that breaks through a dam, bang, and then the passion of hatred is like a river that digs itself deeper and deeper into its bed. You don't notice. There's no moment when you will notice, but as time goes by, suddenly it's really solidly there.
Yeah, that is a beautiful picture, especially because it also captures this kind of long-term undermining that hate has, and because it captures the kind of almost rot, from the word rotting, that it creates. Although in a way, if we look at it as a attitude or as a disposition rather than an immediate affect, there's still a way in which you can say, or I guess I'm curious about this. So if somebody is capable of hating the Moor or hating the Jews or what have you as an attitude, and then they strategically calculate how to, some point in their life, realize or turn that hatred into policy or what have you, is it enough that they have that capability to say that this is a hateful person? So in other words, for a person who's a loving person, a person who's in some sort of gratifying long-term relationship, you say they are a person capable of love. They are a loving father. They are a loving husband, regardless of what they feel in moment one or in moment two. It seemed to me that you'd be right to say the same about a person capable of hate, that they're a hateful person.
Yes, if they are disposed to act hatefully.
Well, what if they're not, though? Because they can't. So somebody might hate the Moor but live in Cambridge, where the atmosphere is cosmopolitan or liberal, or hate the Jew and live in Copenhagen, and so on and so forth. So, I've had neighbors like that, neighbors that are disposed to it but can't act on it. And I wouldn't want to spare them moral judgment.
No. I don't know. In that situation, maybe hatred spills over into ressentiment.
Yeah.
Defined as this, centrifugal reliving of certain emotions endlessly, because you have the inclination, but you don't have the power to act on them. So you cannot let go of the feeling that you are justified feeling this or that, but you also cannot act out the feeling, and then it simmers and keeps.
Thomas, can you be wrong about hating? Can you think that you hate acts and be wrong about
it? Problem? Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. I think, as you can be wrong about, I think sometimes it's illuminating to try think through also through love. So many similarities, also differences, but certainly also similarities. And I guess you can realize that you thought you were in love, but actually you were not. And I think that one of the ways we know whether we hate something or someone is exactly by observing, noticing, reflecting on what we are otherwise feeling, what we are ready to do. So you love you realize maybe that you love someone. Maybe you were not aware that you did it, but you realize it by the happiness you feel in her, his presence, the sadness, the sorrow you feel as they are away, and so forth. And in the same way, maybe with hatred, you could say that it's so unclear what does it mean to hate. So you could say that, well, I realize slowly that I hate you. And I realize that by the tons of bad feelings that I'm right now sitting talking here with you. Yeah, I'm overwhelmed by.
Gradually. I'm sorry I made you feel that way.
Yeah, but in that sense, you could say that there's some kind of a dialectic, so there's a relationality between this kind of arch attitude and many different emotions that we will be disposed to feel or not feel, and we detect whether we harbor the deeper long-term attitude as we are put in different situations where different emotions appear or do not appear.
That's really good. That's
in
really
that sense, you could say that you are not really aware. I mean, that you can be wrong about hating. And it's also, and now we are talking about hatred as an attitude felt by reasonable persons who are able to reflect. But if we move to the discussion, for example, in Jean-Paul Sartre of the hatred of the anti-Semite, it's almost defined by Sartre as an instance of bad faith, about lying to yourself. And in that sense, I'm not sure whether the anti-Semite, as depicted by Sartre, would even know that he hates.
Yeah, in a way, there's an interesting context in which that question comes up in this country, where there's a real inflation of using emotional language. So you hear it from children, you hear it from adults, but they hate and they love things very, very easily. That would be a kind of, if you want, a silly example of being wrong about hating something. You know, my daughter hating her cereal, or people absolutely loving a TV show.
But I guess you can use it about pretty much anything. From cucumber, philosopher seems to like cucumbers, or what is it, cauliflower, or what is it? Broccoli. I think it's broccoli that always appears as the example of a trivial, simple hate. And but I guess that the criterion for hating in a vernacular, common, everyday sense could be that you hate something if you wish for living in a world without that something. Doesn't mean that you necessarily want to rid the world of this something, but you want to live in a world where you don't have to bother with that. And the second thing would be that it's something essential, or something that is not accidental about this something that you want to eliminate. If you hate broccoli, you will not be able to eat it if you are served a yellow broccoli or another kind of broccoli, or any broccoli is bad. If you hate something, if you hate the Tutsi, moving now to the dark blue, if you hate the Jew or the Tutsis or whatever, you hate them all. I mean, children, soldiers, civilians. I hate, or someone hates these kind of people. And this goes all the way back to Plato's very first analysis of hate. The mysologist or mysologue hates all kinds of argumentation, not just bad argumentation, not just bullshit. He hates argumentation per se. And at the same, the misanthrope hates human beings.
Per se.
But that might be, I think, what we could call prototypical hatred, paradigmatic hatred, this kind of universalistic attitude. And then comes some of the problems, for example, in the field of hate crime, where you find discussions whether misogyny or whether rape can be a hate crime. And there, without people, because people have seldomly reflected on the meaning of hate, so they use, without really reflecting on it, the criterion that if it's hate, it must be all women that must be hated. But I'm not sure. I think it's better to think about these features of hatred as a prototypical categories that allow for less clear instances.
That makes a ton of sense. You know, as I was thinking about our conversation this morning, when I was driving back home, I listened to the radio, and there's a new scandal here with one of the persons in the South. His last name is Moore. I'm blanking for the moment on which state he's from. He's running for a Senate seat. He just won the Republican primary in one of the southern states, and he seemed like a complete. It's a very conservative state. He seemed like a complete shoo-in to become the senator from that state. And then over the weekend or a few days ago, reports started coming out that years ago he had behaved inappropriately sexually to underage girls, to 14-year-old girl, maybe more than one. Again, I'm not 100% on the details. And the interesting thing was, as they interviewed people, they interviewed his constituents, a very powerful sentiment was that even if all of this turned out to be true, he's denying it, but even if it all turned out to be true, they would certainly vote for him because it's better than a Democrat winning that seat. And that was a quote from several people. Yeah. And it struck me thinking about the materials that I read from you, that in a way that would be an indirect way in which you find out how much you hate somebody. If you prefer a pedophile to a Democrat politically, with everything that's absolutely wrong with that, you also find out how much you hate Democrats by doing that. So it struck me as a case of discovering hatred almost indirectly, or almost this kind of way of deducing hatred.
Yeah, that could be.
Yeah. So, and Thomas, I'm really, really looking forward to reading this book when it comes out. I'm gonna be the first person to buy it.
Thank you. Thank you for talking with me.
It was a lot of fun. And I guess I hope to talk to you and to see you again soon.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording.